Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, adapted from the novelization by J.R. Millward, based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield, with Adam Coover, with music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Episode 15.
You're a damn fool, you know that?
Light speared through the slats in the blind, cross-hatching a yellow barcode across my bunk. Alexis frowned as I folded a shirt. There wasn't much. Most of the guys acquired a few trinkets over the years. Photographs, letters from home, that sort of junk. I preferred to travel light. Maybe. I tossed him my dress kepi, grinning when he caught it without flinching. I always looked ridiculous wearing it, or any kind of uniform for that matter. The Legion had been a safe harbor, somewhere for a stupid kid to run off and gather his wits for a few years, nothing more. Jesus Christ, but I was glad to be leaving.
If this is about what happened in Rwanda.
You know it isn't, Lexi. It's all in the report if you want to read it. If they ever declassify the papers. The suitcase weighed almost nothing. Alexis blocked the door. I made the effort to smile. He was, had been, a friend. I owed him that much.
Look, the guys, well, they didn't see what I saw. Be careful.
You think something's going to leap out and tear me up in some dark alley?
Don't do anything stupid, Trent. There's probably something out there with the grudge, and even you're not invincible.
I had nodded and strode out of the barracks on a windy October afternoon, and onto a new chapter in the comic book that was my life. That had been 6 years ago. I breathed in through my nose. The ammonia bleach reek of the Strahof's lower levels had awoken the memory so strongly, I could almost see Alexis's face in front of me and hear his prophetic warning all over again. I'd lost count of the times we'd mopped the barracks floors, sluicing and scrubbing until our hands were blistered and raw. The smell would always take me back to Obanya, but I hadn't expected to encounter it here. Of all the people I've served with during my 5 years at the Foreign Legion, Alexis had been one of the rare few to call me Trent, or just plain Curtis. Officers always barked, "Corporal Trent!" and the rest whispered behind my back, a nickname I hadn't asked for but couldn't get rid of. Demon Hunter. Maybe I was a damn fool, as Alexis had said, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. I wasn't going to rest until Eckhart was dead. Well, Laura, looks like you and I are on the same team. For now. It might have been easier, however, if she had known that fact before turning off the main power grid. Not that I doubted her abilities, far from it. Alexis and the guys would have never left me alone if he knew how much she impressed me. Lady Lara Croft, British aristocrat. Oh yes, I had said to myself, observing her over my newspaper that morning in Paris. A horsey little rich girl, probably more interested in partying, polo, and watching Wimbledon than getting down to gritty reality. How wrong I was. The thought made me smile, despite my present surroundings. The image of her standing there in the Louvre, disarmed and furious, sweaty and caked with muck from escaping Brother Obscura's resting place, was not going to leave me for a long, long time. And she had my second shard. I'm not a pious man, surprisingly given my background, but I still sent up a prayer to the Almighty for solving that little problem. She'd acted with far more savvy than I had. No, her abilities were not in question, but her judgment had just added a whole pile of complications to my life. Astrov was huge. From my research, I knew that the final shard was almost certainly in Eckhart's personal care, and that meant gaining access to the deepest levels in the complex. The schematics I obtained were clear on one point. I wasn't going anywhere without restoring power. The main generator hub lay right below Dr. Muller's bioresearch facility. I was close, and Lara was, almost certainly, not going to be wandering around to cause more mayhem till I got back. Well, I could hope. The doors ahead of me were unlocked and creaked open at the slightest touch. So far, I'd only come across a handful of guards, but the fact only increased my caution. All 6 of the Cabal members were gathered together in one place, with the Sleeper, no less. The place should have been stiff with security, but it wasn't. For all I knew, my attempts to cover my tracks had been compromised, and Eckhart was watching me on a CCTV monitor at this very moment. Agreeing that it was worth the risk, I drew back into the shadows, sucked in a deep breath, and let it happen. It takes a lot of concentration, and tends to freak people out the rare times I've been forced to do it in company. I've only seen it being done a couple of times by others trained in the art, but I can understand why people find the process unnerving at first. My eyes rolled back in their sockets, and my face became slack-jawed. The sight of my own body was always slightly disturbing. Christ, I needed a shave, but I'd gotten used to it by now. Disembodied, I turned and whirled through the solid wall like it was made of smoke. A dark pall hung over my vision as I skimmed along white-tiled corridors and down flights of poorly lit staircases. My ethereal hearing caught echoes of noises, grunts and terrified panting, muffled moans and howls that no human throat should have been able to produce. Ignoring the staff-only sign, I plunged on through a dimly lit reception area. The imprint of other people's fear slowed me down, far more of a barrier to my mind than the steel-reinforced doors or chain-link security barriers. The emotions draped the ether like strands of dense, clinging cobwebs. With a surge of effort, I roamed to the furthest reach of my tether, questing for danger, but repulsed by the obscene pseudo-sensations dripping from every surface. Might as well have tried swimming through congealed sewage. There, a form, moving back and forth with a rolling, mindless gait. It was gray to my sight, as though drained of all life's color, and yet there was enough humanity left to its motions to make me hesitate. I couldn't pause for long. A prickling behind my eyes was warning enough that I was already pushing my luck. Regretfully, I retraced my path. My body was waiting, pale and sweating. I sank into welcoming flesh, and jolted as I took a gulp of real air. It always did that, like taking a deep, deep dive underwater. Some of the adepts I've trained with could stay under for hours. A few might have gotten as far as the generator room itself, maybe even tripped the power back on, without ever needing to go down there in person. No point in deluding myself. I was still a kid by comparison. Yes, that was my own fault for walking out of my training. Time to do things the old-fashioned way. Cautiously, I crept down the hallway and followed the path my mind's eye had taken. Antiseptic stink grew stronger. In the reception area, rusty manacles lined one wall next to a few battered wooden chairs. Patches of the linoleum had melted, either from fire or acid. The few lights that were still working sputtered fitfully. Probably loose connections, I told myself, trying to ignore the yawning, unnatural depth of the shadows that seemed to follow my every move. The aura of misery and degradation was even worse when viewed through my physical senses. I kept my gun loose, an old Heckler & Koch USP that I'd customized in my spare time. But my ultimate defense lay with my father's untimely legacy, dangling from a strap at my hip. It felt cool to the touch. No amount of body heat would change that, and no amount of blood would stain its bronze surface. Its name, in Latin, only hinted at its potential for violence. As always, it reacted to my inner musings, sliding up to my hand like a faithful dog nuzzling its master. My fingers clasped through its deceptively fragile structure and tingled. The contact brought the familiar comfort. I was not alone. The desk at reception stood empty. No one was around to challenge me as I pushed my way through the security barriers. I shivered, narrowing my eyes. Such a mundane factor out of place hinted that the atmosphere couldn't just be put down to a bad case of nerves. Heavily barred doors stood at intervals down the corridor. The walls glistened with condensation from a burst pipe. The hiss of escaping steam was the only sound. Almost. I tensed. There was a shape ahead of me, half hidden in the haze. A man in a guard's uniform, prone and whimpering some 10 feet away. It's not enough to react to a threat. Instincts can get you killed. What matters is how you analyze a threat, which is why, instead of opening fire like a trigger-happy amateur, I cocked my head and listened even harder. The move probably saved my life. The guard gave a scream as a claw burst through his shoulder tendons and dragged his whole body out of view. I had a glimpse of a shape as it leapt, its shadow grisly against freshly splattered blood on the wall, and yanked the hapless man into the mouth of a ventilation shaft. I was stunned. Jesus, I'd never seen anything that fast. With my gun drawn, I sidled up for a closer look and tripped on something fleshy and damp. The bloody stump of an arm. There was no sign of an owner. And I thought this is going to be one of my easy days. I listened as the bumps and scuttles moved further down the vent. I wasn't suicidal enough to risk facing a close-quarter enemy in a confined space. I'd learned that particular lesson many years ago, and still had the scars to prove it. On reflex, I rubbed the pale traces just above my cheekbone. Despite his misgivings about my heroics, Alexis had witnessed only a fraction of my skills that day in Rwanda. I had saved the squad, but from then on, he and the rest of the boys had built up a wall around their dealings with me. Humans hate having their worldview shaken up, especially if reality contradicts the notion that we're on top of the food chain. No one had wanted to trust their memories of the attack, and by default that meant not trusting me either. It made my father's final gesture all the more ironic. A whispering alerted me to danger. I spun around, cursing my wool gathering, and listened. I found him cowering in one of the cells. He flinched at my shadow and tried to hide under the bed, the only piece of furniture in the place.
Don't hurt me! Don't hurt me!
Hey, take it easy. I knelt by the door, keeping one eye on the corridor while the man trembled and tried to squeeze further behind the tubular metal frame. He wore a bizarre straitjacket, encrusted with all manner of filth. His shaven head was covered with bruises, scratches, and horribly familiar signs of torture. His arms were raised defensively, and he squinted at me through swollen eye sockets. What's going on down here?
Black Angel's gonna kill us.
Get a grip. Just relax. I'm not gonna hurt you. Now tell me, what's gonna kill us?
The protoid got free. We could vet it, but it ate the cards when the power got shut down.
What the hell's the proto?
The Screamer, the Black Angel.
So much for answers. Look, I don't give a damn about Black Angels and Screamers. Just tell me, what are you doing down here?
Didn't sign on for this.
here?
4 days on the road. From Turkey. A long way. A long way.
From Turkey? What did you bring here? Listen to me. What were you carrying?
25 tons. Stone. The sleeper. Drove here. Must have been drove here. Then they grabbed us. She looked. I said here with her hungry bed. A screamer. The proto.
He lapsed into silence, rocking back and forth. It was pointless to push him any further. As a prisoner, he was at the bottom of the pile for keeping up to date on current events. But his babbling had tipped me off to my most pressing concern, that whatever this proto was, it was between me and my objective. As if I didn't have enough to deal with already. Stay here. Keep the door locked. Even as I said it, I knew it was probably a wasted effort. But the man amazed me by shuffling over to the door. For a moment, he actually looked up and seemed to notice my face.
You see the others. Kill them. Don't let Screamer get too fast.
Pursed my lips and slid the bolt closed. For a moment, I was tempted to end his misery right there. A bullet between the eyes might have been the kindest gesture, but he kept on staring through the open hatch, right at me, as if drawing strength from my image. It was a thing the adept said happened occasionally, when ordinary foe came close to us. Swallowing, I slammed the hatch closed and turned away. The last thing I needed was a guardian angel complex. These poor bastards didn't need a symbol. They needed action. Was it possible Eckhart had already awoken the sleeper? The very thought made me reach for the metal at my side. But though it thrummed gently at my touch, it did not react with all the fury and flame I knew the sleeper's presence would have provoked. Something else had grabbed that guard. The proto. The screamer. Black Angel. Get a grip, Curtis. After Rwanda, a rogue man-eating monster wouldn't be enough to even make me raise a sweat. Yeah. And maybe if I kept repeating it, I'd start to believe it too. It wasn't hard to find my way around. The trail of victims gave it away. Down echoing corridors and past rows of cells, around every corner and against every wall. I hesitated to even call them bodies. An arm or puddle of slick gore. A gnawed and limbless trunk next to coagulating splash marks, where arteries had been slashed and allowed to spew like fire hoses across walls and ceilings. Other, far worse sights made me grateful for my empty stomach. Unusual I may be, but I'm still human in that regard. Even the ever-present stench of antiseptic couldn't mask that amount of carnage. Perhaps even worse than the bodies, however, were the things sat propped against the walls, or else shambled down the halls. Many simply stood without point or purpose, staring at nothing. They had the forms of men, but experience had taught me the hard truth about appearances. The first creature refused to respond to questions, a shaken shoulder, or even a slap to the face. It continued gazing down the hall, mouth open and drooling, with eyes as empty as broken windows. Whatever they had been, they could no longer be truly classified as men. They all wore the same dirty straitjackets as the truck driver. All had the same shaved heads and marks of physical brutality. A few sported rusty steel plates, or had wiring jury-rigged into their scalps. I even found one of them sitting, its legs splayed like a toddler's, while his hands rubbed endless circles into the spilled gore. I made sure they died quickly, just as the driver had asked. It was easy to see now why my intrusion hadn't exactly brought the guards running. The Strav had bigger problems to worry about. The endless corridors and cells had finally come to an end. I leaned against a pillar, scanning the wide-open space that must have once been a dining hall. Utilitarian tables and chairs lay in heaps, mangled out of recognition. A live electrical cable dangled from the ceiling, hissing and spitting like an angry viper. Most of the floor was awash with debris, and bodily fluids darkened to black under the fluorescent bulbs. The vomit-inducing stench of processed food almost triumphed over the reek of death. I hadn't the stomach to investigate behind the serving area, which, given my background, is saying something. Instead, I proceeded to the end of the hall, eventually reaching a T-junction. More groans issued from behind closed doors. I hoped the inhabitants hadn't realized the locks weren't working. One door, however, stood ajar. Green light traced across the floor, accompanied by the hum of a computer fan.
Unease. Resolve.
Cautiously, I risked a quick glance at the interior. I started breathing again several lifetimes later. A snarling set of jaws yawned at my eye level, as though ready to pounce. It took several moments to realize that the thing was well and truly dead, suspended in the center of the room by a bizarre apparatus. I lowered my gun and pushed my way inside, fighting revulsion with every step. It took all of my military discipline to focus on the factual details of the room. A man in a lab coat lay like a discarded toy against a computer workstation. His white hair and goatee were immaculate, in contrast to the dreadful wounds that disfigured his torso. He died with one arm wrapped around his stomach, vainly trying to keep his intestines where nature intended. The rest of the room had been divided up by folding perspex screens. Computers, most of them tripped by the power cut, glowed softly on standby mode and were the source of the greenish light. Insulated cables snaked across the floor and draped across a crazy gazebo structure that took up most of the room's center. Hanging in the gazebo, like a slaughtered pig, was the most bizarre creature I'd ever set eyes upon. What in the hell? 6 feet long from snout to tail, its anatomy seemed to mix the worst features of a baboon and a prehistoric warthog. Greasy, grayish skin, with muscles exposed and held together with pus-covered bandages. Twisted, unnatural shapes of bone pierced the flesh, barely following the lines of the underlying skeleton. Its simian hands had sharpened talons instead of nails, and a lilac-colored tongue drooped from between its wolfish jaws. Even the smell of it was unnatural, blending formaldehyde and marsh gas with the unbearable putrefaction of rotten fruit. That wasn't the worst thing. Far more disturbing was the fact that the corpse had obviously been there for quite some time. Something else had to have killed all those men, and it was still on the loose.
Data. Quickly.
Holstering my gun, I hustled over to the nearest workbench and leafed through the piles of printouts. Most were predictably observations on the thing's physiology. Heart rate, blood pressure, that sort of crap. Part of me hoped that my instinctual reaction had been wrong, and the freak was only a random mutation. My hand snatched at a report as it slipped from the pile. I was shaking as I read the title. Stage 4, Primary Dissection of Proto-Nephilim, a report. Author, Dr. K. Boaz. My God! They've actually created a Nephilim hybrid. Am I too late? The metal at my hip grew warm, reacting to the surge of emotion. I suddenly wanted to run, to get myself as far as possible from the stink and the gore and the death. With one hand, I screwed up the report and flung it away, as though by doing so I might gain some distance from the reality dangling right in front of me. The knowledge, the responsibility, was too much. If I didn't stop this thing, here and now, then my father and all of his followers would have died for nothing. It wasn't a word, but a memory to nudge aside my fear. I clasped the metal disc until my hand was positively thrumming. It knew that I wasn't afraid of Eckhart's creations. Only a failure. In only a few moments, I was in control once more, remembering my father's teachings. Three deep breaths in the recitation. Relax. Expel fear. Reject doubt. Lux veritatis mecum. I would see the Black Alchemist dead, no matter what monsters lay between us. Then, the screaming began.
In episode 15 of Tomb Raider, The Angel of Darkness, Curtis Trent, Alexis, the Chiragai and prisoner were played by Adam Coover. Written and adapted by J.R. Millward. Based on an original story by A. Murty Schofield. With music by Peter Connolly and Martin Iverson. Additional sound effects courtesy of www.freesfx.co.uk, the BBC, and the YouTube Audio Library. Produced by Stephen Millward. Lara Croft and Tomb Raider are the property of Crystal Dynamics and Square Enix.